Walt Whitman was born May 31st, 1819, in West Hills, New York. A few years after he was born, his family moved to Brooklyn, New York, where he would grow up. He finished his formal education at age 11 and began working for a law firm as an office boy in 1830. By 1831, he was working for the Long Island Patriot, where he was taught the printing trade and immersed in the newspaper industry. Tough times forced Whitman back to Long Island in 1836 when he took up a job as a teacher. Working in the newspaper industry had sparked his love for writing and journalism, and in 1838 he attempted to start his own newspaper, the Long Islander, which unfortunately failed. By 1841, he returned back to New York to work in journalism, and from 1846 to 1848 he was the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle. He promptly left the Eagle in 1848 to travel to New Orleans to start a newspaper. However, this project quickly ended when Whitman got into a disagreement over slavery with his business partner and returned back to New York. Whitman had already published many articles, works of fiction, and even a few poems. However, in 1855 he released his breakout work, Leaves of Grass, a book of free verse poems largely about American society. In 1862, Whitman left New York and traveled to Washington, D.C. in search of his brother George, a Union soldier. When he found him in the hospital, superficially wounded, he decided to stay in Washington and work as a clerk throughout the war. This is where he remained until 1873, when he suffered a stroke and moved to Camden, New Jersey, in order to be closer to his family. Until his death on March 26, 1892, Whitman traveled the country giving lectures about Abraham Lincoln and published several literary works, including many editions of Leaves of Grass. Walt Whitman had many literary influences throughout his life. Growing up, his father exposed him to the teachings of philosophers like Thomas Paine and Francis Wright. When he was working in Brooklyn, Walt spent his days alone in the city, visiting the public library, touring museums, and attending theater performances, with Shakespeare plays in particular being his favorite. As a young professional in New York, Walt fell in love with opera and would attend performances often with his brother. Around the time he published Leaves of Grass, it is said that Ralph Waldo Emerson had a big influence on Walt. Whitman even sent him a copy of his book, and when Emerson responded with a letter, he published a version of the book with part of that letter on the spine in gold leaf. Historical events, of course, had a very large influence on Walt Whitman. He first witnessed the horrors of slavery when he traveled to New Orleans, and his poems often showcase his opinions against slavery. When the Civil War broke out, his own brother George enlisted as a Union soldier. When he visited George in the hospital, he was profoundly impacted by the things he saw there. His experiences during the Civil War in Washington, D.C. inspired him and remained with him for the rest of his life. One of the historical events that impacted Whitman greatly was the death of President Abraham Lincoln. Walt was in the process of publishing a book of poems titled Drum Taps, inspired by his experiences during the Civil War. However, after the assassination of President Lincoln, he didn't feel the book was complete without poems honoring the great fallen president. He was too late to stop the book from publishing. However, he quickly published Drum Taps, a sequel, that included poems When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed and O Captain, My Captain, in order to pay tribute to President Lincoln.
In this section, we will be discussing and analyzing the poem O Captain, My Captain by Walt Whitman, written in 1865. Let's begin with the speaker. The speaker in this poem can be seen as someone who looked up to Abraham Lincoln throughout his presidency. The speaker compares the assassination of Lincoln to a crew member losing the captain of the ship. This conveys the speaker's deep gratitude and reverence for Lincoln. This could possibly be Whitman himself or simply be a metaphor of society as a whole. Next, we can talk about situation. The situation of this poem involves the horrible assassination of Abraham Lincoln. An excerpt from the poem reads, For you bouquets and ribbon wreaths, for you the shores a crowding, for you they call, the swaying mass, their eager faces turning. The author is able to include the population of the United States within the work as victims of this tragedy. The details of this poem reveal that not only is the speaker mourning his death, but the entire country is mourning as well. Next up, we will be talking about theme, setting, and tone. To begin, the main theme of this work is respect. The author used the term captain extensively throughout the poem, showing the reader how much respect the president had during this time. An excerpt reads, "Here, Captain, dear father." Aside from captain, the author refers to Lincoln as a father, which also conveys a sense of respect that one would have for their own father. Next, we'll talk about setting. "O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every wreck." Whitman mentions a ship throughout the poem. However, it can be understood that the setting of this poem is not necessarily on a ship. Whitman used the ship to symbolize the country as a whole, with Abraham Lincoln as the captain. Lastly, we'll talk about tone. The tone of this piece revolves around triumph, grief, and despair. This was a very trying time for America, especially since they had viewed the president as the captain of their ship and the father of their country.
In the analysis of the word choice of the poem, it could be noted that Whitman uses strongly connotated words throughout. For example, the use of the word grim instead of dark or sad more deeply and accurately expresses the emotion conveyed in that sentence. Another example would be the excessive use and repetitiveness of "my captain." The use of "my" suggests the bond between the speaker and the captain. Also, the implementation of the exclamation point in the title and throughout the poem adds a note of desperation and excitement. This also alludes to a type of a poem title that's called an apostrophe, a term for when the speaker calls out to someone who's not actually there. After the captain dies, the speaker is in the position of making this appeal to a person who's not able any longer to respond to him. In direct observation of the word order of the poem, it could be said that the language is pretty straightforward. With the exception of some words like rack and cue, the word order is shifted around a bit to make the poem rhyme. However, Whitman really wants us to focus on the subject of the poem and not get caught up in parallels or any poetic forms that might cause us to think something differently than what the poem is actually telling us. If you read the poem out loud, you can't help but find its rhythms. For example, when Whitman says, "From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object one." Though these words might sound a little funky, being switched around in the way that they are, you get the point and it rhymes. Another instance where Whitman uses inverted word order is when he says, "For you, the flag is flung." Here, the emphasis is on the "for you." What Whitman is really trying to capture is the relationship and bondage between him and the captain, or more so, the nation and the president. For you, we will do this. For you, we will do this. And the inversion of these words helps to create that emphasis and helps to really capture the meaning of what this poem is about. Whitman's poem is started with bouts of visual imagery. For example, his lips are pale and blue, swaying masses. For you, bouquets and ribbon wreaths, or bleeding drops of red and mournful tread. Whitman's choice to use powerful words such as these helps the reader to visualize the death of the captain, and the condition of the ship as such. Whitman also goes about his poem using figurative language. The repetition of "fallen cold" and "dead" is used throughout the poem various times. This repetition creates a required music quality in the poem. Being that the poem is an elegy or mournful poem or song, this quality really stands out throughout the poem. Another use of figurative language is that of a metaphor. The first extended metaphor is the captain, used in the first line that runs throughout the poem. The captain represents Lincoln, who loses his life in the battle. The second metaphor is the voyage, which then represents that of the Civil War. The journey is full of trials and tests, but the ship is now nearing the port, representing the timeline of the Civil War and what would be celebration. The third metaphor, which is the ship, represents the United States having gone through such. Whitman also uses symbolism throughout his poem. The ship's anchor could be considered to symbolize the end of the Civil War and Lincoln's death. Or even the voyage could symbolize the Civil War and Lincoln's life. When the speaker says that the anchor is safe and sound, Whitman is most likely referring to the country being out of a state of war and hopefully an upcoming peace. After a thorough analysis of Whitman's poem, it could be ultimately determined that it was written in the style of an elegy, considering the fact that it was written in honor of the late Abraham Lincoln after the Civil War. However, it is not only in honor of Lincoln, but in honor of the victory of the war and to mourn the loss of the leader of a nation. This brings us back to the essential theme of the poem, respect for our country's fallen leader, and patriotism for the triumph of the war. The overall importance of Whitman's poem is that it unintentionally became a staple for the entire country to both mourn and celebrate the conclusion of the war. The conclusion of the poem in its entirety really comes together through the use of the literary devices that Whitman uses, such as symbolism, metaphors, imagery, word choice, and so on. The main visual image of the poem is a celebration as the ship comes into the port. The image of the dead captain on the deck contrasts with the first scene in order to place emotional emphasis on his death. Or, for example, the captain represents the president and the ship in turn represents the United States. The trip is the Civil War and the price is keeping the Union together. It's things like this that really bring the poem together and help us capture the style of this poem as Whitman tried to express.